The Crithian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 2,000 years and conquered 300 worlds without mercy. They came to Earth 5 years ago expecting another easy victory, but they found something they had never encountered before. They found humans who refused to die quietly. Admiral Jacob Hayes stood on the bridge of the carrier ESS Defiance, watching the enemy fleet maneuver in orbit above the scarred planet he called home. His fleet was down to 42 ships from the 300 they started with, but the Crithians had lost far more. Their armada of 2,000 vessels was reduced to fewer than 300, and those ships were damaged and running low on supplies. Commander Lisa Grant studied her tactical display and reported that intercepted communications showed panic among enemy ranks. The Crithian generals were arguing with each other and some were demanding withdrawal. Jacob smiled grimly because the Empire had never tasted defeat before and they did not know how to handle it. On the surface, Colonel Paul Sherman commanded what remained of the North American Defense Force from a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. His soldiers were exhausted and running on determination alone, but they kept fighting. The Crithians controlled the skies, but humans owned the ground. Every street was a trap and every building was a fortress. Major Amy Rodriguez led her strike team through the snow-covered ruins of Denver after destroying another enemy supply depot. Her people moved like ghosts through territory the aliens thought they controlled. The Crithians had better weapons and armor, but humans had better motivation. They were fighting for their homes and their families and their very existence. Amy watched her soldiers work with pride because they were ordinary people who became extraordinary warriors. Teachers and farmers and office workers who learned to kill invaders with ruthless efficiency. Dr. Henry Blake worked in a hidden laboratory beneath the mountains of New Zealand, far from the main fighting. He had been studying captured Crithian technology for 3 years, trying to find a weakness. The enemy shields were nearly impenetrable and human weapons just bounced off them. Henry barely slept anymore because he knew that millions of people were dying while he searched for answers. Then one night he found it. The shield generators operated on a rotating frequency pattern that repeated every 17 seconds. If you hit them at exactly the right moment with a precisely calibrated pulse, they collapsed completely. Henry immediately sent his findings to every resistance cell and military unit on Earth. Within days, the modified weapons were being distributed to soldiers. Worldwide, Captain Frank Morrison was one of the first pilots to fly with the new shield-piercing missiles mounted under his fighter's wings. His squadron caught a Crithian battle group by surprise over the Pacific Ocean and destroyed 12 enemy cruisers before they could react. Frank whooped with joy as he watched the alien ships explode because for 3 years he had been throwing rocks at giants. Now he had a sling that actually worked. The news spread fast and human forces went on the offensive everywhere. The Crithians suddenly found themselves being hunted by the prey they thought they had cornered. Emperor Valdrin received the reports from Earth with disbelief turning to rage. No species had ever resisted this long, and now they were actually winning battles. His advisors whispered that other conquered worlds were watching, and if Earth succeeded in driving off the Empire, then rebellions would spread. Valdrin made his decision and ordered his final reserve fleet to crush humanity once and for all. 500 warships armed with weapons that could crack continents launched toward Earth. The Emperor sent a message to his fleet commander telling him to show no mercy and leave no survivors. Earth would be made an example that the galaxy would never forget. The reserve fleet arrived expecting to find a broken enemy, but Admiral Hayes was waiting for them. He had positioned his ships in the massive debris field left by 5 years of orbital combat. The wreckage of thousands of destroyed vessels created a maze of metal and radiation that masked sensor readings. Lieutenant Commander Greg Foster coordinated the ambush from the operations center and watched the enemy fleet advance into the trap. The Crithians were confident in their numbers and did not bother with proper reconnaissance. Hayes waited until they were deep in the debris field, then gave the order to attack. Human ships emerged from hiding on all sides, launching missiles and firing energy weapons at point-blank range. The Crithians tried to form defensive positions, but they were scattered and confused. Captain Nina Lewis commanded the destroyer ESS Vengeance, leading her battle group straight at the enemy flagship. Her ship was held together with patches and prayers, but her crew fought like demons. On Mars, Colonel Danny Price launched every ship the colony had to support Earth. The Martian vessels were mining ships converted into warships, and they looked ridiculous, but they carried crews who remembered Earth as home. The battle raged for 3 days without pause, and human crews fought past exhaustion. Engineering Chief Karen Bell kept the Defiance running despite damage that should have destroyed the ship twice over. She rerouted power through systems never designed for combat loads and threatened to shoot anyone who suggested giving up. Captain Steve Morgan's fighter squadron ran out of missiles on day 2 but kept attacking anyway. They used kinetic weapons and even rammed damaged enemy ships when they had no other choice. Steve led his pilots in singing old Earth songs over the communications channel as they charged into enemy formations. Their voices carried across the void, defiant and unbroken. The Crithians had never faced an enemy like this, and it terrified them. Sergeant Laura Kim led a Marine boarding team onto the Crithian flagship. Through a hull breach her squad had blown open. They fought through corridors designed for creatures twice their size, but Marines adapted and improvised. Laura's team reached the bridge and killed the fleet admiral in close combat. His death threw the enemy command structure into chaos. Commander Betty Shaw intercepted messages showing Crithian commanders requesting permission to withdraw, but the Emperor never responded. Unknown to the fleet, Valdrin was dead and killed by his own generals as the Empire collapsed into civil war. By the end of Day 3, the Crithian reserve fleet was destroyed. 200 ships were debris and the rest fled in disorder. Admiral Hayes gave the order to pursue because humanity was done being prey. They were hunters now, and they had tasted blood. Admiral Hayes reformed his battered fleet and made a decision that changed everything. For 5 years, humans had fought defensively and protected their home world against impossible odds. But now it was time to take the fight to the enemy. He called his commanders together and told them they were going after the nearest Crithian stronghold. Commander Gary West argued for caution and said the fleet needed time to repair and regroup, but Hayes refused. The Crithians had burned Earth and killed billions, and they would answer for their crimes. Humanity could not rest while the Empire still existed somewhere out there plotting revenge. The other commanders agreed because they all had lost too much to stop now. The ESS Defiance led 70 ships toward Caraxes Prime, which was the main Crithian fortress world in this sector. Captain Julie Brooks commanded the ships from Europa, which were ice miners converted into carriers for small attack craft. The journey took 2 weeks, and during that time the fleet prepared for battle. Major Claire Thompson drilled her Marines constantly because ground combat on an alien world would be different from fighting on Earth. Her soldiers had survived 5 years of hell, and they were ready for anything. As the fleet crossed into Crithian space, they started receiving strange signals. Commander Pete Johnson analyzed the transmissions and realized they were distress calls from conquered worlds. The species the Crithians had enslaved were rising up everywhere, inspired by humanity's resistance. On Thalros 4, a species called the Villani had overthrown their overseers and taken control of their planet. Pete led a diplomatic team down to meet with the Villani leadership and offered alliance. The Villani were tall, thin creatures with 4 arms, and they spoke through musical tones that human translators struggled with. Their leader made it clear that they had been waiting centuries for someone to stand up to the Empire. Humanity had shown them that the Crithians could bleed and could be beaten. Pete promised them support and weapons in exchange for intelligence about Crithian positions. The Villani agreed immediately and provided detailed maps of enemy bases throughout the sector. The fleet arrived at Caraxes Prime and found the orbital defenses in chaos. Half the stations were dark and damaged from internal sabotage. The slave workers who maintained the stations had turned on their masters. Captain Andy Martinez led the initial assault, and his battle group overwhelmed the remaining defenses with ease. The Crithians tried to fight back, but their command structure had collapsed. Ships ignored orders, and some even fired on each other, as different factions fought for control. Colonel Roger Bennett commanded the first wave of ground forces, and his dropships descended through the atmosphere under heavy fire. The landing was rough, but they made it down and established a beachhead near the planetary capital. The soldiers found themselves fighting in a city that looked nothing like home. The buildings were massive pyramids made of black stone, and the streets were wide enough for vehicles 3 times the size of human tanks. The Crithians themselves were huge creatures that stood 3 meters tall with 4 arms and thick armored hide. They were stronger than humans, but slower and less adaptable. Bennett's forces used speed and tactics to overcome the size difference. They moved through the city in small teams, hitting targets and vanishing before the enemy could respond. The Crithians had ruled through fear for so long that they did not know how to handle an enemy that refused to be afraid. Dr. Susan Parker accompanied the invasion force as a xenobiologist, and her job was to study the enemy. She found a research facility in the conquered city and went through their files with help from translators. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The Crithians had been studying human DNA, trying to understand what made humanity so dangerous. Their scientists had concluded that humans possessed genetic traits that should not exist in a species that evolved naturally. Humans adapted faster than any other species and had a capacity for both violence and compassion that seemed contradictory. The Crithian researchers were terrified of what humanity might become if they survived. Lieutenant Helen Myers worked in intelligence, and she spent her time breaking into enemy computer systems. She found communications between Crithian core worlds that revealed the full extent of the Empire's collapse. The Emperor was dead and murdered by generals who blamed him for the disaster at Earth. Now those generals were fighting each other for control while conquered species rebelled everywhere. The Empire that had lasted 2,000 years was tearing itself apart in months. Helen brought her findings to Admiral Hayes and showed him maps of Crithian territory. Entire sectors were in open revolt, and the enemy fleet was scattered trying to put down rebellions. Hayes called a council of war to decide what to do next. The meeting was held aboard the Defiance in a conference room that had seen better days. The walls were scorched from a fire that nearly destroyed the ship during the battle at Earth. Captain Walter Green argued for total war and said humanity should destroy every Crithian military installation in the galaxy. His daughter died in the first bombardment of Tokyo, and his hatred was shared by many. Commander Linda Hayes, who was the Admiral's daughter, took the opposite position. She said humanity fought to preserve their values, not to become monsters like the Crithians. Genocide was wrong even when the victims were enemies. Dr. Kevin Ross was a historian serving as civilian advisor, and he reminded everyone that cycles of revenge only led to more suffering. Earth's own history was full of examples. Major Sally Moore commanded a battalion that fought through the ruins of Sydney, and she spoke for the common soldiers. She said mercy must be earned and the Crithians should face justice for their crimes but not extermination. There were civilians on Crithian worlds who never wanted this war, and killing them would make humans no better than the Empire. Admiral Hayes listened to all sides and made his decision. The fleet would continue liberating occupied worlds and dismantling Crithian military power, but would not engage in wholesale slaughter. Enemy soldiers who surrendered would be treated as prisoners, and civilians would be protected. War criminals would face trial instead of execution squads. The fleet split into task forces to cover more territory. Captain Chris Palmer led ships to the mining worlds where slaves had been worked to death for generations. His arrival was met with celebration by the freed workers who could barely believe their nightmare was over. Commander Alice Turner commanded forces that secured Crithian industrial centers and prevented their destruction. The factories and shipyards would be needed for reconstruction. On Earth, President Victoria Mills addressed the survivors via quantum broadcast. She spoke about building a new future where humanity would protect the weak instead of exploiting them. The message was heard across the galaxy and gave hope to billions living under tyranny. The war was ending, but the hard work of building peace was just beginning. Colonel Jack Ryan led peacekeeping forces on liberated worlds and found the work harder than combat. His soldiers were trained to fight, not to mediate disputes between former slaves and their former masters. On Veloth 7, the local population wanted to execute every Crithian they could find, and Ryan's Marines had to physically stop lynch mobs. He understood their anger because he had seen what the Empire did to conquered peoples, but revenge killings would only create more problems. Ryan established courts where Crithians could be tried fairly for their crimes. The guilty were punished and the innocent were released. It was messy and frustrating work, but it was necessary. Lieutenant Joyce Adams was a psychologist attached to the peacekeeping forces, and she spent her days talking to traumatized populations. The species the Crithians enslaved had suffered for decades or even centuries under brutal occupation. Some had been used as labor in mines and factories, while others were kept as servants or worse. Joyce documented everything because history needed to remember what happened here. She interviewed thousands of survivors and recorded their stories. The tales of suffering were almost too much to bear, but she kept working because someone had to bear witness. The galaxy needed to understand the true cost of the Empire's reign. Captain Simon Lee commanded the science vessel ESS Discovery, and his mission was to find Crithian weapons of mass destruction. Intelligence suggested the Empire had developed weapons that could destroy entire solar systems, but their locations were secret. Simon's team tracked down research facilities and military bases across multiple worlds, searching for these nightmare weapons. On Krython 4, they found a warehouse containing biological weapons designed to target specific species, DNA. The weapons were sophisticated enough to kill every member of a species while leaving others untouched. Simon ordered the entire stockpile destroyed and the facility sealed. On Mordex Prime, they discovered quantum missiles that could destabilize a star and cause it to go supernova. These weapons were too dangerous to exist, and Simon had them transported to a black hole and disposed of permanently. The war wound down slowly over months as Krythian forces surrendered piece by piece. Some units fought to the death out of loyalty or fear, but most chose survival. Captain Nina Lewis found herself accepting the surrender of a Krythian admiral who had bombarded Earth cities 3 years ago. She wanted to kill him, but instead she took him prisoner and sent him to trial. The admiral would face justice for his crimes, but he would face it in a courtroom, not at the end of a gun. Nina struggled with these decisions because part of her wanted revenge for everything she had lost. Her home city was radioactive ruins and her family was dead, but she forced herself to follow orders. Humanity had to be better than their enemies, or the victory meant nothing. On Mars, the colonies were thriving now that the war was over. Colonel Danny Price became colonial governor and worked to transform the Red Planet from military outpost to permanent settlement. The Martian shipyards that built warships during the conflict now produced exploration vessels and cargo haulers. People from Earth were emigrating to Mars and the other colonies looking for fresh starts. Danny approved every application that crossed his desk because humanity needed to spread out and grow. Keeping everyone on one planet was too risky after they nearly lost everything. The species needed to become truly interstellar to ensure their survival. Admiral Lisa Grant took command of the Solar Defense Fleet, which was Earth's new military force. The fleet was smaller than the wartime armada, but more advanced and better trained. Lisa drilled her crews constantly because she knew the galaxy was still dangerous. The Krythian Empire was dead, but its remnants were scattered across hundreds of worlds. Some Krythian warlords tried to carve out their own territories and had to be stopped. Pirate groups raided shipping lanes and preyed on weak colonies. The defense fleet stayed busy protecting human interests and their allies. Lisa refused to let her people become complacent, because peace had to be defended. Just like war had to be fought, the Villani and other freed species formed an alliance they called the Free Worlds, coalition with humanity as a founding member. Ambassador Pete Johnson represented Earth in the new government and helped write laws that would prevent future empires from rising. The coalition charter guaranteed rights for all sentient species and banned slavery in any form. It established rules for warfare that protected civilians and prisoners. Pete worked 18-hour days because building a new galactic order was harder than tearing down the old one. Different species had different values and different needs. Finding compromises that everyone could accept took patience and skill. Captain Julie Brooks commanded the exploration vessel, ESS Pioneer, leading missions to uncharted regions of space. Humanity's reach expanded through curiosity rather than conquest, and Julie loved her job. Her ship discovered new worlds and made first contact with species that had never heard of either humans or Krythians. She brought them news of the Empire's fall and offers of friendship. Some species joined the coalition immediately, while others preferred to remain independent. Julie respected their choices because freedom meant nothing if it was forced on people. Commander Gary West spent years writing a comprehensive history of the war. His book was titled The Cost and ran to 3,000 pages documenting everything that happened. Gary interviewed hundreds of soldiers and civilians getting their stories before memories faded. He obtained access to classified military records and enemy documents captured during the war. The book he produced was brutal and honest, showing both humanity's courage and their mistakes. Gary did not shy away from describing atrocities committed by human forces because the truth mattered more than propaganda. The Cost became required reading in schools across human space and was translated into dozens of alien languages. On Earth, the rebuilding continued slowly and painfully. Cities rose from ruins, but the scars remained visible everywhere. Memorial walls listed billions of names, and every family had empty chairs at their tables. The planet would never be the same as it was before the invasion, but survivors were determined to build something better. New cities were designed with lessons learned from the war. Buildings included shelters and defenses built into their foundations. Power grids were decentralized so one strike could not cripple entire regions. Agriculture was spread across the planet and the colonies so no single disaster could cause mass starvation. Humanity had paid in blood for these lessons and they would not forget them. Dr. Henry Blake won awards for his shield technology breakthrough, but spent little time celebrating. He focused on converting military technology for peaceful purposes and helped design fusion reactors that could power cities. His work accelerated reconstruction and made energy abundant and cheap. Henry also developed medical applications for the technology he created, saving lives instead of taking them. He felt that was appropriate because too many people had already died. Some Crithian civilians remained on occupied worlds either because they had nowhere else to go or because they chose to stay. Captain Chris Palmer supervised programs that helped them integrate into the new order. Crithians who cooperated and accepted responsibility for their species' crimes were allowed to rebuild their lives. Those who continued to threaten others were deported to designated Crithian worlds under coalition monitoring. 5 years after the war ended, Earth remained a world of memories and monuments. Admiral Jacob Hayes retired from military service and spent his days at the memorial wall in what used to be New York. The black stone structure stretched for kilometers, listing every confirmed death from the war. His son's name was carved near the bottom along with millions of others. Jacob visited every week and ran his fingers over the letters. The physical act of touching the name helped him remember that the sacrifice was real. Young people sometimes asked him what the war was like, and he always told them the truth. War was horror and suffering and loss, but sometimes it was necessary to preserve something worth dying for. Colonel Paul Sherman commanded Earth's military academy, training new generations of soldiers. He taught them strategy and tactics, but also ethics and restraint. Paul wanted his students to understand that military force was a tool to be used carefully, not a solution to every problem. The cadets respected him because he had fought through 5 years of hell and earned every scar he carried. Paul emphasized that humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their courage, but their refusal to become monsters even when fighting monsters. The lessons were hard to teach because young soldiers wanted simple answers. They wanted to know who was good and who was evil, but reality was more complicated. Major Amy Rodriguez left the military and opened a school in rebuilt Denver. She taught history to children who had been born during or after the war. Amy made sure her students understood what their parents and grandparents had sacrificed. She showed them pictures of Earth before the invasion and explained what was lost. But she also taught them about the choices humanity made during the darkest times. She told them how soldiers showed mercy to defeated enemies and how civilians shared food with refugees from other species. Amy wanted her students to know that humanity was defined not by how they killed, but by how they chose to live. Dr. Susan Parker continued, studying Crithian biology, trying to understand the species that nearly destroyed Earth. She worked with Crithian scientists who survived the war and wanted to atone for their people's crimes. Together they made discoveries about both species that surprised them. Humans and Crithians were more similar genetically than anyone expected. Both species had evolved as persistence hunters and both had strong social bonds. The difference was cultural, not biological. Crithians had built an empire based on domination, while humans valued individual freedom. Susan published papers arguing that no species was inherently evil and that circumstances shaped behavior more than genetics. Lieutenant Helen Myers became director of Coalition Intelligence and worked to prevent future wars before they started. Her network of agents monitored potential threats across dozens of worlds. When tensions rose between species, Helen sent mediators to resolve disputes peacefully. When warlords tried to build new empires, she organized coalitions to stop them. The work was endless and often thankless because successful prevention meant nothing dramatic happened. Helen was fine with that because she had seen enough drama to last several lifetimes. Boring peace was better than exciting war every single time. Captain Frank Morrison retired from combat flying and became a test pilot for civilian aerospace companies. He helped design passenger ships that would carry people between worlds safely and comfortably. Frank missed the thrill of combat sometimes, but he found satisfaction in building instead of destroying. His wife had died during the war and he never remarried, but he mentored young pilots who reminded him why he fought. The future belonged to them, and Frank wanted to make sure they had good tools to build with. President Victoria Mills served 2 terms leading Earth through Reconstruction, then stepped down. She refused pressure to serve a 3rd term because she believed in limits on power. Victoria had seen what happened when leaders stayed too long and accumulated too much authority. The Crithian Empire fell partly because Emperor Valdrin could not adapt to changing circumstances. Victoria made sure Earth had strong institutions that would outlast any individual leader. She established courts and councils with real power to check the executive branch. Democracy was messy and slow, but it was better than the alternatives. Commander Betty Shaw retired and wrote her memoirs about serving on the Defiance during the war. Her book focused on the ordinary crew members who kept the ship running, despite impossible odds. Betty told stories about engineers who worked around the clock and medics who saved lives with inadequate supplies. She described cooks who made meals from rations designed to last weeks and stretched them for months. Her book became a bestseller because people wanted to read about real heroes, not just admirals and generals. Betty donated all her profits to veteran support programs. On the Crithian homeworld, a new government struggled to establish legitimacy. The species was divided between those who accepted responsibility for the Empire's crimes and those who blamed others. Some Crithians claimed they were just following orders, while others insisted the conquered species provoked their own suffering. The truth was complicated because millions of Crithians served the Empire in various ways. Some were soldiers who committed atrocities, but others were farmers and workers who just tried to survive. The new Crithian leadership had to navigate these divisions while also dealing with external pressure from the coalition. Captain Walter Green never forgave the Crithians and refused to accept their surrender personally. He transferred to Frontier Patrol, where he hunted pirates and slavers far from Crithian space. Walter knew his attitude was not productive, but he could not let go of his hatred. His daughter's death haunted him every day, and he blamed an entire species for his loss. Other veterans understood his pain even if they disagreed with his choices. Grief affected people differently, and Walter's grief turned to permanent anger. Commander Linda Hayes followed a different path and worked with reconciliation programs. She met with Crithian survivors and listened to their stories. Linda learned that many ordinary Crithians opposed the war but had no power to stop it. The Empire was a dictatorship that crushed dissent brutally. Citizens who spoke against military policy disappeared into prisons or worse. Linda shared her findings with anyone who would listen, because she believed understanding prevented future conflicts. Not everyone wanted to hear that enemies were complex human beings with their own struggles. Simple narratives of good versus evil were more comfortable than messy reality. Dr. Kevin Ross taught at universities across coalition space, lecturing about the war's lessons. He compared the Crithian Empire to historical empires from Earth and found similar patterns. Empires rose when one group gained military advantage over others and used that advantage to dominate. Empires fell when costs exceeded benefits or when subject peoples found ways to resist. The Crithian Empire followed the pattern almost perfectly. Kevin argued that preventing future empires required addressing the conditions that created them. Species needed alternatives to war for resolving disputes and systems that distributed resources fairly. Major Sally Moore commanded coalition peacekeeping forces deployed to trouble spots across the galaxy. Her troops were multinational and multi-species, drawing from dozens of worlds. Moore's soldiers kept factions separated while diplomats negotiated settlements. The work was dangerous because peacekeepers often got caught between hostile groups. Moore lost soldiers to ambushes and terrorist attacks, but she kept her people focused on their mission. Peace required patience and presence and sometimes sacrifice. The alternative was letting conflicts spiral into full wars that would cost far more lives. 10 years after the last shots were fired, Earth had transformed from a battlefield into a thriving world again. The cities rebuilt during Reconstruction were cleaner and more efficient than the old ones. Parks covered areas that were once parking lots, and public transportation replaced private vehicles in most places. The changes were not just about technology, but about values. People who survived the war wanted to build a society worth the sacrifice their loved ones made. They wanted cities where children could play safely, and where neighbors knew each other. The old world had problems that the war made impossible to ignore. Inequality and poverty and environmental damage all contributed to humanity's vulnerability when the Crithians came. The New World tried to address those problems through better systems and shared responsibility. Captain Chris Palmer returned to Earth after years in space and barely recognized his home. He walked through New Seattle, which rose from the radioactive ruins of the old city. The buildings were shorter than before and surrounded by green spaces. Solar panels covered every roof and wind turbines lined the coast. Chris met people from a dozen different species walking the streets because Earth had become a cosmopolitan hub. Humans had learned during the war that allies were precious and diversity was strength. The city felt alive in ways the old Seattle never did. People seemed more connected to each other and to their community. Admiral Linda Hayes commanded deep space exploration missions pushing into regions no one had mapped before. Her ship ESS Pathfinder discovered evidence of ancient civilizations that predated even the Crythian Empire. On a dead world orbiting a red giant, they found ruins of structures that must have been kilometers tall when they stood. The architecture was unlike anything humans or any known species built. Helen brought xenoarchaeologists to study the site, and they spent months carefully excavating. What they found suggested a civilization that spanned multiple galaxies before collapsing for unknown reasons. The discovery raised profound questions about humanity's place in cosmic history. Commander Pete Johnson became the Coalition's Secretary General, leading the Alliance of Free Worlds. His job was impossibly complex because he had to balance the interests of hundreds of species with different needs and values. Some species were aggressive expansionists while others preferred isolation. Some valued individual rights above all while others prioritized collective welfare. Pete spent his days in meetings trying to forge compromises that no one loved, but everyone could accept. He succeeded more often than he failed because the alternative to cooperation was a return to empire and war. The species that joined the coalition remembered what tyranny cost, and most were willing to work together to prevent its return. On Mars, Governor Danny Price announced plans to terraform the planet over the next century. The project would cost trillions of credits and require cooperation from dozens of worlds, but it was achievable. Engineers would thicken the atmosphere and warm the surface until Mars could support Earth-like ecosystems. Danny would not live to see the finished product, but he worked to ensure future generations would. The Martian colonies had proven that humans could thrive off Earth. Now it was time to turn the red planet into a true second home for humanity. The project employed thousands of workers and became a symbol of what peaceful cooperation could accomplish. Dr. Henry Blake died peacefully in his sleep at age 78. His funeral was attended by leaders from across the coalition because his shield technology breakthrough saved billions of lives. Henry left behind a foundation that funded scientific research and education. He specified that the foundation should support scientists from all species, not just humans. Henry believed that knowledge belonged to everyone, and that scientific progress required diverse perspectives. His students and colleagues continued his work developing technologies that improved lives across the galaxy. Major Amy Rodriguez watched her students graduate and felt immense pride. These young people grew up in a world at peace, and they took it for granted in the best possible way. They did not remember the war except from history lessons and stories. Amy's generation carried scars that would never fully heal, but they made sure the next generation did not have to carry the same burden. Some critics argued that children should be taught to fear and prepare for war, but Amy disagreed. Children should be taught to value peace and understand its cost. They should learn that war was sometimes necessary but never desirable. Captain Simon Lee discovered something remarkable while disposing of the last known Crythian superweapon. The weapon used technology based on principles that human science said were impossible. Simon realized that the Crythians had made breakthroughs that could revolutionize physics if understood correctly. He brought the weapon to a secure research facility instead of destroying it. Scientists studied the device for years, learning principles that led to faster-than-light travel without using conventional jump drives. The technology made exploration and trade between distant systems practical and safe. Simon's decision to preserve rather than destroy enemy technology paid dividends no one anticipated. President Victoria Mills lived long enough to see Earth fully recovered and died surrounded by family. Her funeral was broadcast across coalition space, and leaders from hundreds of worlds attended. Victoria was remembered not for military victories but for the institutions she built. The democratic system she established ensured that power remained dispersed and accountable. Earth's government included representatives from all regions and all economic classes. Decisions required consensus and compromise, which was frustrating but prevented tyranny. Victoria understood that preserving freedom required constant effort and eternal vigilance. Admiral Jacob Hayes visited the memorial wall one last time before he died. He was 93 years old and his body was failing, but his mind remained sharp. Jacob touched his son's name carved in the black stone and whispered words only the dead could hear. He told his son that humanity survived and thrived and built something worth protecting. The sacrifice was not wasted and the future was bright. Jacob died that night in his sleep with a peaceful expression. His funeral was attended by thousands of veterans who served under his command. They remembered him as the admiral who never gave up even when defeat seemed certain. The galaxy 10 years after the war looked nothing like it did before. The Crithian Empire was dead and replaced by dozens of independent states. Some thrived under new leadership, while others struggled with the transition from dictatorship to democracy. The coalition mediated disputes and provided assistance but did not impose solutions. Each species had to find its own path forward. Humanity's role in the new order was complex and sometimes controversial. Some species saw humans as liberators and heroes, while others viewed them as just another powerful species seeking dominance. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Captain Nina Lewis commanded coalition patrol forces hunting the last remnants of Imperial loyalists. Small groups of Crithian hardliners refused to accept defeat and conducted terrorist attacks across multiple worlds. Nina's ships tracked them down relentlessly, showing no mercy to those who would not make peace. She understood that lasting peace required eliminating threats to that peace. The work was dangerous and unpopular, but necessary. Nina lost ships and crews to ambushes, but she never wavered. The final Imperial holdout was destroyed 5 years after the official war ended. Earth's Memorial Wall became a pilgrimage site visited by millions every year. People came from across coalition space to see the monument and pay respects to those who died. The wall included names from every nation and every background because the war touched everyone. Rich and poor, young and old, soldier and civilian all sacrificed together. Visitors left flowers and tokens at the base of the wall. Some carved messages into the stone, adding their own words to the monument. The wall grew longer each year as researchers confirmed more casualties. Forensic teams still searched ruins, finding remains and identifying victims. Each name added was another piece of history preserved. Commander Gary West's comprehensive history. The cost became the definitive account of the war. Every school in coalition space used it as a textbook, and military academies required officers to study it. Gary's work influenced how future generations understood the conflict and its lessons. He emphasized that victory came not from superior weapons or tactics, but from humanity's refusal to surrender their values. Humans won because they fought for something larger than themselves and never forgot why they were fighting. The book ended with a warning that peace required the same dedication that won the war. Complacency would invite new threats and new empires. Humanity ensured its future with blood and fire, but the price was always visible. Every family had stories of loss and sacrifice. Every city had monuments to the fallen. The survivors carried memories that would never fade and scars that would never heal. But they also carried hope that their suffering meant something. They built a galaxy where species cooperated instead of conquered, and where diversity was celebrated instead of destroyed. The future was uncertain because it always was. But humanity faced it with confidence earned through survival. They had been tested by the worst the galaxy could throw at them, and they endured.